You didn't notice it happen, and that's exactly why it matters. There was no breaking news alert, no sudden crash, no moment where everything visibly fell apart. Instead, it slipped in quietly, almost politely, hiding inside everyday life. It showed up the last time you checked your bank account and felt that brief pause, the kind where something doesn't look wrong enough to panic, but doesn't look right either. It's there when your grocery bill feels just slightly heavier than it should be, when a full month of work somehow translates into less breathing room than the one before it. And here's the uncomfortable part. Most people don't blame the system when that happens. They blame themselves, they assume they spent too much, saved too little, lacked discipline, missed something. But if you step back for just a second, the pattern starts to reveal something else entirely. Because this isn't happening to a few people. It's happening across income levels, across cities, across lifestyles. Households that are doing everything right, stable jobs, controlled spending, no reckless decisions, are still ending the month with almost nothing left. And that's not a feeling anymore. That's data. Today, in multiple developed economies, including the United States, studies consistently show that even households earning what used to be considered comfortable incomes, $80,000 and $90,000, even $100,000 a year, are reporting minimal leftover savings after covering basic expenses. Not luxury, not excess, just baseline living. And when a system reaches a point where doing everything correctly still doesn't produce stability, the problem is no longer individual, it's structural. But here's where it gets more unsettling. The system hasn't collapsed, not visibly. Stores are still full. People are still buying things. The economy, on the surface, still looks like it's moving. And that illusion is what makes this moment so dangerous.
Because when pressure builds silently, without a clear breaking point, it doesn't trigger immediate reaction. It stretches people instead. It normalizes strain. It teaches them to adapt to conditions that would have felt unacceptable just a decade ago. Think about how quickly expectations have shifted. A grocery bill that would have shocked you a few years ago now barely gets a reaction. A rent increase that once felt outrageous is now something people reluctantly accept and adjust around. A lifestyle that used to include saving, planning, and some level of financial breathing room has quietly transformed into one where the goal is simply to make it through the month without falling behind. And the most important detail in all of this is that the shift didn't happen through one dramatic change. It happened through hundreds of small ones, layered over time, each just manageable enough to tolerate. That's how systems don't break. They erode. And when they erode slowly, people don't resist them. They adapt to them. But adaptation has a cost. Because every time a household adjusts, cuts back on food quality, delays medical care, leans slightly more on credit, postpones saving, they're not solving the problem. They're absorbing it. They're carrying pressure that used to be distributed across a functioning system. And over time, that pressure accumulates in ways that are hard to see from the outside but impossible to ignore from the inside. So the real question isn't whether people are struggling. That part is already clear. The real question is why the system still looks stable while the people inside it feel increasingly unstable. Why consumption hasn't collapsed, even when financial comfort has. Why the numbers suggest resilience while everyday experience suggests something very different. Because if you can understand that gap between what the system shows and what people actually feel, you start to see what's really holding everything together right now. And more importantly, how fragile that stability actually is. The easiest place to see where this pressure becomes real isn't in a financial report or a government data set, it's in a grocery store. Not because food is the biggest expense people have, but because it's the one expense they interact with the most. It's immediate, it's frequent. And unlike rent or insurance, it forces a decision every single week. That's what makes it so revealing. Because when something fundamental begins to shift in a system, it doesn't show up first in the numbers. It shows up in behavior. And grocery stores today are full of behavioral signals that something deeper has changed. Start with something simple. The way people shop. There's a visible hesitation now, a pause in front of shelves that didn't exist before. People aren't just picking what they need. They're calculating, comparing, adjusting in real time. Items that used to go into carts automatically now get reconsidered, swapped, or quietly put back. That change alone tells you something important. It tells you that the margin, the small financial cushion people once had, is gone. Because when margin exists, decisions are fast. When it disappears, every choice becomes deliberate. And the numbers behind that hesitation are not imaginary. Over the past few years, food prices have risen significantly across multiple categories. In the US, for example, grocery prices saw one of their fastest increases in decades during the early 2020s, with staples like eggs, meat, and dairy experiencing sharp spikes at different points due to supply chain disruptions, feed costs, and inflation pressures. Eggs, which for years hovered around a relatively low and stable price range, surged multiple times due to avian flu outbreaks affecting supply. Beef prices climbed as production costs increased. Cooking oils, grains, and packaged foods followed similar upward trends. These aren't luxury items. These are foundational components of a basic diet. And when foundational costs rise, the impact doesn't stay contained. It spreads across the entire household budget. But here's what makes food different from every other expense category. It's flexible. You can't negotiate your rent every week. You can't decide to skip your insurance payment without consequences. But food, you can adjust. You can buy less. You can switch brands. You can stretch ingredients across more meals. You can delay a purchase. And because of that flexibility, food becomes the pressure valve of the entire financial system at the household level. When costs rise elsewhere and there's no room left to absorb them, the adjustment shows up here first. Not because people want to cut back, but because they have no other option. And the data reflects exactly how those adjustments are playing out. Across income groups, not just lower-income households, there's been a noticeable increase in store brand purchases replacing name brands. Bulk buying has grown, not as a sign of abundance, but as a strategy to reduce per-unit cost in a high-price environment. More importantly, there's been a quiet shift in what people are actually buying. Fresh produce, higher-quality proteins, and perishable items are often the first to be reduced, not all at once, but gradually. One less item this week, another the next, until the overall basket changes shape. What replaces them tends to be more shelf-stable, calorie-dense, cost-efficient options. It's not about preference, it's about survival within a fixed budget. The reason the system still looks stable, even when households feel increasingly unstable, comes down to one mechanism that rarely gets discussed in plain terms: debt. Not the dramatic kind that shows up in headlines, but the quiet, normalized, everyday kind that has embedded itself into how people live. Because here's the reality: the gap between what life costs and what people earn hasn't disappeared. It hasn't been solved, it's being financed. And that distinction changes everything. At a surface level, nothing looks broken. People are still shopping. Bills are still getting paid. Transactions are still happening at a scale that suggests a functioning economy. But if you look just one layer deeper, the structure starts to look very different. In the United States, total credit card debt has crossed the $1 trillion mark, a record level. At the same time, average interest rates on those balances have moved above 20%, making it one of the most expensive forms of borrowing widely used in everyday life. And yet, usage hasn't slowed, it's increased. That alone tells you something critical. People aren't relying on credit because it's convenient. They're relying on it because it's necessary to maintain continuity. But credit cards are only part of the picture. Over the last decade, a new layer has been added: buy now, pay later services. What started as a niche option for online shopping has quietly expanded into everyday spending categories: clothing, electronics, even groceries in some cases. The psychological appeal is obvious. Split a payment into smaller, manageable pieces without immediate strain. But structurally, it does something more important. It allows consumption to continue even when cash flow doesn't fully support it. It smooths over the gap, making financial pressure less visible in the moment while extending it into the future. Auto loans tell a similar story. The average cost of vehicles has risen significantly, and instead of reducing demand, the SIST,